The dust kicked up from Jake Morrison's horse as he rode through the narrow canyon pass, the Arizona sun beating down mercilessly on his weathered face. He had been tracking stolen cattle for 3 days, following hoof prints and broken branches deeper into Apache territory than any sensible man would venture alone. The year was 1882, and tensions between settlers and the Apache ran higher than a summer fever. Jake pulled his hat lower over his eyes, squinting against the glare reflecting off the Red Canyon walls. At 32, he had spent half his life on horseback, working cattle ranches from Texas to Colorado. His calloused hands gripped the reins with practiced ease, while his keen eyes constantly scanned the rocky terrain for signs of trouble. The Colt 45 on his hip had seen its share of action, but Jake preferred talking his way out of problems when possible. As he rounded a bend in the canyon, the sound of angry voices echoed off the stone walls. Jake reined in his horse, a sturdy bay mare named Belle, and dismounted quietly. He crept forward on foot, using the large boulders as cover until he could see into a small clearing ahead. What he witnessed made his blood run cold. 7 young Apache women, their hands bound with rope, stood beneath a massive cottonwood tree. Their faces showed a mixture of defiance and fear as 3 white men in dusty clothes prepared nooses with methodical precision. The youngest of the women couldn't have been more than 16, while the oldest appeared to be in her 20s. Their traditional Apache clothing was torn and dirty, suggesting they had been captives for some time. "This'll send a message to those savages," growled the tallest of the men, a bearded brute with a scar running from his left ear to his jawline. "Nobody steals from the Wickham spread and gets away with it." Jake recognized the name immediately. Samuel Wickham owned one of the largest cattle operations in the territory, and his reputation for ruthlessness was well known among the ranch hands. The man speaking had to be Wickham's foreman, Tom Briggs, whose violent methods had earned him fear and respect in equal measure. The second man, thin and wiry with nervous eyes, shifted uncomfortably. "You sure about this, Tom? Hanging women don't sit right with me. Maybe we should just run them off." "Shut your mouth, Peters," Briggs snarled. "Mr. Wickham's orders were clear. Make an example that'll stop these thieving redskins once and for all." The third man remained silent, but Jake could see the gleam of silver on his vest. A badge. This wasn't just vigilante justice. Law enforcement was involved, which made the situation even more dangerous. Jake's mind raced as he assessed his options. 3 armed men against 1, with 7 innocent lives hanging in the balance. The odds weren't in his favor, but he couldn't ride away and let these women die. His father had raised him to believe that a man's character was measured by what he did when nobody was watching, and Jake had never forgotten those words. He checked his weapons, the Colt 45 at his hip and the Winchester rifle in his saddle scabbard back with Belle. The rifle would give him better range, but he'd have to retrieve it without being spotted. Moving carefully, he made his way back to his horse. The oldest of the Apache women, a striking figure with intelligent dark eyes, seemed to sense his presence. She glanced in his direction briefly, but made no sign that might alert the men to his location. Jake admired her composure under such dire circumstances. As he reached Belle, Jake heard Briggs barking orders. "Get that rope over the branch, Peters. And you, Deputy Carson, keep watch. I don't want any surprises." So the third man was Deputy Carson, Jake realized. This went deeper than simple vigilante justice. This was an official execution, though Jake doubted it had any legal backing. The corruption in some frontier towns ran deeper than mine shafts, and it seemed Samuel Wickham had bought himself a deputy. Jake pulled his Winchester from its scabbard and checked the ammunition. He had 12 shots, which would have to be enough. Taking a deep breath, he positioned himself behind a large boulder that offered a clear view of the clearing while providing good cover. The Apache women were forced to stand on wooden crates beneath the hanging ropes. Jake could see tears on some of their faces, but none of them begged or showed panic. Their dignity in the face of death stirred something deep in his chest, a mixture of admiration and fierce determination to save them. "Any last words, ladies?" Briggs asked mockingly, his scarred face twisted in a cruel grin. The oldest woman raised her chin defiantly. In clear English, she said, "The spirits of my people will haunt you for this injustice. Our blood will cry out from the ground, and justice will find you." Briggs laughed harshly. "Your spirits don't scare me, squaw. Where were they when we caught you stealing our cattle?" "We took nothing that was not already stolen from us," she replied with quiet dignity. "This land belonged to our fathers and their fathers before them." Jake had heard enough. These women were being executed for alleged cattle theft, but something in the woman's words and bearing told him there was more to this story. Either way, he couldn't let innocent people hang based on accusations alone. He raised the Winchester and took careful aim at the rope holding the oldest woman. The shot would have to be perfect, close enough to sever the rope without hitting her. Jake had always been an excellent marksman, a skill that had saved his life more than once in his wandering years. The crack of the rifle echoed through the canyon like thunder. The rope snapped cleanly, and the woman dropped the few inches to the ground, immediately rolling away from the tree. The three men spun around, searching for the source of the shot. "Up in the rocks!" Deputy Carson shouted, drawing his pistol. Jake was already moving to a new position, using the boulder-strewn landscape to his advantage. He fired again, this time cutting the rope holding the second woman. Briggs and his men began shooting wildly at the rocks, their bullets sparking off stone but finding no target. "Spread out!" Briggs roared. "Find that son of a gun!" Jake continued his deadly accurate shooting, severing rope after rope while staying mobile. His years of hunting and ranch work had taught him to shoot under pressure, and he used every trick he knew. The Apache women, understanding what was happening, began helping each other remove the nooses and untie their bonds. When Peters moved to recapture one of the freed women, Jake put a bullet in the ground at his feet, sending the nervous man diving for cover behind a tree. "Come on out and fight like a man!" Briggs shouted into the rocks. Jake had no intention of making it easy for them. He continued picking his shots carefully, always moving, always using the terrain to his advantage. When Deputy Carson tried to circle around behind him, Jake put a shot close enough to his badge to make the corrupt lawman think twice about his career choice. By now, all 7 women were free and helping each other toward the far end of the clearing. The oldest woman looked back toward Jake's position and called out in Apache, then in English, "Thank you, brave one. We will not forget." With the women safely away from the hanging tree, Jake faced a choice. He could try to escape while the 3 men were still confused and disorganized, or he could press his advantage and try to capture them. The smart play was to retreat, but something about this whole situation bothered him. There was more going on here than a simple cattle theft accusation. Jake made his decision. He wanted answers. Moving swiftly through the rocks, he managed to get behind Deputy Carson's position. The corrupt lawman was so focused on watching for movement in front of him that he never heard Jake approach from behind. "Drop your gun," Jake said quietly, pressing the barrel of his Colt against the deputy's neck. Carson complied immediately, his hands shaking. "Don't shoot, mister." "I was just following orders." "Whose orders?" Jake demanded, keeping his voice low so the others wouldn't hear. "Wickham's. He said they stole cattle and we were supposed to make an example. It was all legal-like." Jake doubted that very much. "What about the hanging? That legal, too?" Carson's silence spoke volumes. From across the clearing, Briggs called out, "Carson, where are you? Sound off!" Jake pressed his gun harder against the deputy's neck. "You're going to tell your friends that you're done here. Tell them the Apache women got away and it's time to head back to town." "They'll know something's wrong," Carson whispered. "Then you better be convincing," Jake replied. "Because if they come over here and find me, you'll be the first one to meet your maker." Deputy Carson cleared his throat and called out, "The women got away, Tom. They scattered into the rocks. We'll never find them now. Maybe we should head back. There was a long pause before Briggs responded. Get over here, Carson. We're not done yet. Jake could see the fear in the deputy's eyes. The man was caught between his corrupt boss and an angry stranger with a gun, and neither option looked good for his continued health. Tell him you twisted your ankle, Jake instructed. Tell him to come to you. Carson followed orders, and Jake heard movement as Briggs and Peters made their way through the rocks. This was going to be tricky. 2 against 1 when they arrived, but Jake had surprise on his side. The sound of approaching footsteps grew louder. Jake positioned himself behind a large boulder, using the deputy as a shield. When Briggs and Peters came into view, their guns drawn and eyes scanning the area suspiciously, Jake was ready for them. Drop your weapons, he commanded, stepping out with his Colt aimed at Briggs's chest. This doesn't have to end badly for anyone. Briggs's scarred face twisted with rage. You made a big mistake, Cowboy. Do you know who you're messing with? A man who hangs innocent women, Jake replied evenly. That tells me everything I need to know about your character. Peters looked ready to bolt, but Briggs held his ground. Those weren't innocent women. They were cattle thieves. We caught them red-handed. Where are the cattle? Jake asked. I don't see any stolen livestock around here. The question seemed to catch Briggs off guard. He glanced at Peters, who looked even more nervous than before. They were driven off when we caught the thieves, Briggs said, but his voice lacked conviction. Jake sensed weakness and pressed his advantage. 7 women drove off a herd of cattle? How exactly did they manage that without horses or weapons? The silence stretched out like a taut rope. Finally, Peters cracked under the pressure. Tom, maybe we should just forget about this whole thing. Head back to the ranch and tell Mr. Wickham the job's done. Shut up, Peters, Briggs snapped, but it was too late. Jake had heard enough to confirm his suspicions. So this was all about sending a message, Jake said. There were no stolen cattle. You were just going to murder 7 innocent women to scare the Apache into submission. Briggs's hand inched toward his gun, but Jake was watching for exactly that move. I wouldn't if I were you, Jake warned. I've got nothing against killing men who prey on innocent folks. The Mexican standoff continued for several tense seconds before Briggs finally let his shoulders slump in defeat. What do you want, Cowboy? I want the truth, Jake replied, and I want to know why Samuel Wickham thinks he can order executions without trials. Deputy Carson, still held at gunpoint, began talking before anyone could stop him. It wasn't supposed to be executions. Mr. Wickham just wanted to scare them, but then Tom said it would be better to make it permanent. Said scared Indians tell stories, but dead ones don't. Jake felt his anger rising. These men had been planning cold-blooded murder, and they were discussing it like a business decision. Where are these women supposed to have stolen cattle from? Jake demanded. The North Pasture, Briggs muttered. But there ain't been cattle there for weeks. We moved the herd south for better grass. The pieces were falling into place. Jake realized this whole thing was a setup from the beginning. Someone wanted these particular Apache women dead, and cattle theft was just a convenient excuse. Why these 7 women specifically? Jake pressed. What made them special? Another uncomfortable silence. Finally, it was Peters who spoke up, his voice barely above a whisper. They've been asking questions in town about their missing brother. Now Jake was getting somewhere. What kind of questions? About the silver mine up in Devil's Canyon, Deputy Carson said, earning a furious glare from Briggs. Their brother worked there before he disappeared. Jake felt the pieces clicking together in his mind. The Wickham Ranch bordered Devil's Canyon, and silver mining was a lucrative business in this part of Arizona. If something illegal was happening at that mine, and if the missing Apache man had discovered it, then his sister's questions would be very dangerous to certain people. What happened to their brother? Jake asked. He had an accident, Briggs said quickly. "Mining's dangerous work." The way he said it convinced Jake that it had been no accident at all. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the canyon floor. Jake knew he needed to end this confrontation soon and get these three men secured before dark. But he also knew that simply letting them go would mean death sentences for the 7 Apache women he had just saved. Briggs and his boss wouldn't give up easily. "Here's what's going to happen," Jake announced. "Deputy Carson, you're going to arrest these 2 men for attempted murder." Carson's eyes went wide. "I can't do that. Mr. Wickham will have my job." "Mr. Wickham's not here," Jake pointed out, "and if you don't do your job as a lawman, you'll be joining them in chains." Jake could see the wheels turning in the deputy's mind. Carson was obviously not the brightest man to wear a badge, but even he could see that his current situation was untenable. "I don't have any shackles with me," Carson said weakly. "Then we'll make do with rope," Jake replied. He gestured to the hanging nooses that still dangled from the cottonwood tree. "Seems fitting, don't you think?" The irony wasn't lost on any of them. Within minutes, Jake had Briggs and Peters tied securely to the tree, using the very ropes they had intended for the Apache women. Deputy Carson, looking thoroughly defeated, agreed to help transport the prisoners back to town. As they prepared to leave the canyon, Jake's mind was already working on the bigger problem. He had saved 7 lives today, but the men behind this attempted murder were still free. Samuel Wickham had enough money and influence to make this whole incident disappear, and the Apache women would still be in danger. Jake realized that his solitary life was about to become much more complicated. He had stumbled into something bigger than cattle theft or even attempted murder. There was a conspiracy brewing in these desert canyons, and innocent people were dying because of it. The first part of his adventure was over, but Jake Morrison sensed that the real danger was just beginning. 3 days after the canyon rescue, Jake Morrison sat in the corner of Murphy's saloon in the dusty town of Copper Falls, nursing a whiskey and keeping his ears open. Word traveled fast in small frontier towns, and he had heard plenty of interesting conversations since bringing Briggs and Peters to jail. Most folks seemed to think the 2 men had been arrested for disturbing the peace, but Jake knew Deputy Carson was too scared to tell the real story. The swinging doors of the saloon burst open, and Samuel Wickham himself strode in, his expensive boots clicking on the wooden floor. Jake had never seen the man in person, but there was no mistaking the tailored suit and gold watch chain that marked him as the wealthiest rancher in 3 counties. Wickham's pale blue eyes swept the room like a hawk searching for prey, and his carefully groomed beard couldn't hide the cruel line of his mouth. "Where's that drifter who's been causing trouble for my men?" Wickham announced loudly, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to getting his way. Jake didn't move from his corner table, but his hand drifted closer to his Colt. Several other patrons quickly finished their drinks and headed for the door, recognizing the signs of impending violence. "You talking to me?" Jake asked mildly, taking another sip of whiskey. Wickham turned toward him, his eyes narrowing. "You're Morrison, the one who interfered with my business up in Red Rock Canyon." "Your business was murder," Jake replied evenly. "I make it a habit to interfere with that kind of business." The saloon went dead quiet, except for the nervous shuffling of Murphy, the bartender, who was trying to make himself invisible behind the bar. Wickham walked slowly toward Jake's table, his hand resting on the ivory handle of an ornate pistol. "Those Apache squaws were cattle thieves. My foreman was carrying out justice." "Your foreman was carrying out orders to commit murder," Jake corrected. "There were no stolen cattle, and you know it." For a moment, Wickham's composed mask slipped, and Jake caught a glimpse of the cold calculation beneath. This man was far more dangerous than Briggs or Peters because he was intelligent enough to plan his crimes carefully. "You're new around here, Morrison, so let me explain how things work," Wickham said, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "I own this town. I own the sheriff, the judge, and half the businesses on Main Street. Those Apache were asking the wrong questions about things that don't concern them. What kind of questions? Jake asked, though he already suspected the answer. Wickham's smile was as cold as winter moonlight. Questions about their brother, Joseph Running Bear. Poor boy had a mining accident a few weeks back. Very sad. But accidents happen when you work with dangerous explosives. The pieces were falling into place for Jake. Joseph Running Bear had discovered something at the silver mine, something worth killing for. His sisters had come to town seeking answers, and Wickham had decided to silence them permanently. "What did Joseph find at your mine?" Jake pressed. "My mine?" Wickham laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I'm a cattle rancher, Morrison. I don't know anything about mining." It was a lie, and they both knew it. Jake had spent the last 3 days asking careful questions around town, and he had learned that the Devil's Canyon silver mine was secretly owned by a company that traced back to Wickham's business interests. The ranch was just a front for his real operations. Before Jake could respond, the saloon doors swung open again, and the oldest of the Apache women he had rescued walked in. She wore a simple dress now instead of her traditional clothing, but her bearing was unmistakably regal. Her dark eyes found Jake immediately, then shifted to Wickham with undisguised contempt. "Maria Delgado," Wickham said, his voice dripping with false courtesy. "I heard you were still in town. Shouldn't you be heading back to the reservation with your sisters?" The woman Jake now knew as Maria ignored Wickham completely and walked directly to Jake's table. "I need to speak with you," she said in perfect English. "About my brother and about what you saw in the canyon." Wickham's hand tightened on his gun handle. "The lady and I were just finishing our conversation, Maria. Perhaps you could wait outside." "I wasn't talking to you," Maria replied without looking at him. Jake admired her courage, but he could see the dangerous glint in Wickham's eyes. "Maybe we should take this conversation somewhere more private," he suggested, standing up slowly. "An excellent idea," Wickham agreed. "Why don't all 3 of us take a ride out to my ranch? We can discuss this matter like civilized people." It wasn't a request, and Jake knew it. He also knew that anyone who went to Wickham's ranch under these circumstances wasn't likely to come back alive. But he needed to know more about what Joseph Running Bear had discovered, and Maria might be his only source of information. "Lead the way," Jake said, his hand never straying far from his weapon. As they walked toward the door, Maria moved close to Jake and whispered, "My sisters are hiding at the old mission church outside town. If something happens to me, find them. They have something that belonged to Joseph." Jake nodded slightly, filing the information away. Whatever Joseph had found, it was important enough that his sisters were risking their lives to preserve it. The ride to Wickham's ranch took them through some of the most beautiful and dangerous country in Arizona territory. Red mesas rose like ancient fortresses from the desert floor, while hidden canyons promised either shelter or death to those who knew their secrets. Jake kept his eyes moving, memorizing landmarks and escape routes in case things went badly. Wickham's ranch was impressive by any standards, with a main house that wouldn't have been out of place in San Francisco and outbuildings that spoke of serious money. But Jake noticed other things too. The armed guards who watched them approach, the nervous way the horses acted around certain areas, and the smell of sulfur in the air that suggested recent blasting. "Welcome to the Lazy W," Wickham said as they dismounted in front of the main house. "Maria, I believe this is your first visit to my home." "It won't be my last," she replied ominously. They were escorted into a lavishly appointed study where Wickham poured himself a brandy and offered nothing to his guests. Jake noticed the safe in the corner and the detailed maps of the local mining claims spread across the massive oak desk. "Now then," Wickham began, settling into a leather chair like a king holding court. "Let's discuss this unfortunate misunderstanding about cattle theft and my foreman's excessive zeal." "There was no misunderstanding," Maria said firmly. Your men tried to hang us to stop us from asking questions about Joseph. Your brother was a troublemaker, Wickham replied coldly. He was caught stealing silver ore from the mine where he worked. When confronted, he became violent and had to be restrained. Unfortunately, the restraint proved fatal. Jake watched Maria's face as she processed this obvious lie. Her expression remained controlled, but he could see the pain and anger burning in her dark eyes. Joseph was many things, but he was not a thief, she said quietly. He was trying to find out who was really stealing from the mine. Wickham's brandy glass paused halfway to his lips. What do you mean, who was really stealing? Maria glanced at Jake, as if weighing whether to trust him with dangerous information. Finally, she reached into her dress and pulled out a small leather journal. Joseph kept records, she said. He wrote down everything he saw at the mine. The real thieves weren't Apache workers taking small amounts of ore. Someone was systematically looting the mine's richest veins and shipping the silver out at night. Jake could see the muscles in Wickham's jaw tighten. This was clearly not what the man wanted to hear. That's a serious accusation, Wickham said carefully. Do you have proof of these claims? Joseph documented everything, Maria replied. Names, dates, amounts stolen. He even drew maps showing where the richest ore was being taken from. He planned to report it to the territorial authorities. Wickham set down his brandy glass with deliberate precision. And where is this alleged evidence now? Maria smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Somewhere safe. Somewhere you'll never find it. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Jake could see the calculation going on behind Wickham's cold blue eyes as the man weighed his options. You know, Wickham said conversationally, the Apache have a reputation for storytelling. Beautiful stories, but not always factual. Perhaps your brother's imagination got the better of him. Perhaps your greed got the better of you, Maria shot back. Jake decided it was time to intervene before the situation exploded into violence. What exactly are you proposing, Wickham? That we all pretend this never happened? Wickham turned his attention to Jake. I'm a reasonable man, Morrison. I believe in live and let live. Maria and her sisters are welcome to return to the reservation with my blessing. No charges will be filed against them for the alleged cattle theft. In return, they stop asking questions about things that don't concern them. And if we refuse? Jake asked. Wickham's smile was predatory. Then I'm afraid you'll discover that accidents happen to troublemakers in this part of the territory. Mining accidents, hunting accidents, riding accidents. So many ways a person can meet an unfortunate end. It was a clear threat, and Jake felt his anger rising. This man thought his money and influence made him untouchable, that he could murder innocent people to protect his criminal enterprise. There's another option, Jake said quietly. Oh? And what's that? You confessed to murdering Joseph Running Bear and attempted murder of 7 Apache women. Make restitution for the silver you've stolen and turn yourself in to the territorial authorities. Wickham laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the study walls. And why would I do something so foolish? Because if you don't, I'm going to expose your operation to everyone from here to Washington, D.C. The laughter stopped abruptly. You're bluffing, Morrison. You have no proof of anything. Maybe not yet, Jake admitted. But I'm a patient man, and I'm very good at finding things people want to keep hidden. Wickham stood up slowly, his hand moving toward his ornate pistol. I think this conversation is over. Jake was ready for the move, but it was Maria who acted first. She threw the leather journal directly at Wickham's face, causing him to duck and giving Jake the split second he needed to draw his Colt. I wouldn't, Jake advised as Wickham's hand froze on his gun handle. For a long moment, the three of them remained frozen in tableau. Then Wickham slowly moved his hand away from his weapon. You're making a serious mistake, Morrison. I have 20 men on this ranch who'll do whatever I tell them to do. Then you better hope they're fast, Jake replied, because the first one through that door is going to find you with a bullet in your chest. Maria had retrieved the journal and was backing toward the window. Jake could see her evaluating escape routes, preparing to run if necessary. "What do you want?" Wickham asked through gritted teeth. "I want Joseph Running Bear's body returned to his family for proper burial," Jake said. "I want a written confession to the territorial marshal about the silver theft. And I want you to leave the Apache alone permanently. And if I refuse, then this becomes a much more complicated situation for everyone involved." Jake could hear movement outside the study door. Boots on wooden floors, the subtle sounds of armed men taking positions. Wickham had signaled for help somehow, probably when he stood up. "It seems we have company," Jake observed. "I hope you've explained to your men that their boss's life depends on everyone staying calm." Wickham's face was flushed with anger and frustration. He was a man accustomed to controlling every situation through wealth or violence, and Jake's resistance was clearly infuriating him. "You can't watch me forever, Morrison. Eventually, you'll have to sleep. And when you do, my men will find you." "Maybe," Jake agreed. "But dead men tell no tales, as they say. And if anything happens to me or the Apache women, certain people are going to receive very interesting information about your mining operation." It was a bluff, but Jake delivered it with conviction. He could see doubt creeping into Wickham's eyes. "What kind of information?" Wickham demanded. Before Jake could answer, Maria spoke up. "Joseph wasn't the only one who kept records. My sisters and I documented everything we learned in town before you tried to hang us. Names, places, amounts of stolen silver, all of it." Jake had to admire her quick thinking. Whether or not it was true, the threat was believable enough to give Wickham pause. A knock came at the study door, followed by a gruff voice. "Boss, everything all right in there?" "Everything's fine, Henderson," Wickham called out, though his voice was tight with strain. "Stand down." Jake could hear the confusion in the voices outside, but the immediate threat seemed to diminish. "Here's what's going to happen," Jake announced, taking control of the situation. "Maria and I are going to walk out of here peacefully. In 3 days, you're going to deliver Joseph Running Bear's body to the Apache camp outside town. You're also going to write a full confession about the silver theft and deliver it to the territorial marshal." "And if I don't?" Wickham asked. "Then the evidence Joseph gathered gets delivered to every newspaper from here to Denver, along with testimony from 7 Apache women about your attempted murder." Jake could see Wickham's mind working, calculating odds and possibilities. The man was clearly looking for a way out that didn't involve confession or restitution. "You're forgetting something, Morrison," Wickham said finally. "Even if you have evidence, who's going to believe the word of a drifting cowboy and some Apache squaws against a respected rancher?" It was a valid point, and Jake knew it. Frontier justice often came down to who had more money and influence, not who was telling the truth. "Maybe nobody," Jake admitted. "But I'm willing to find out. Are you?" The standoff continued for several more tense seconds before Maria broke the silence. "Joseph hid copies of his evidence in multiple places," she said. "Even if you kill all of us, the truth will come out eventually." Whether or not it was true, the statement had the desired effect on Wickham. Jake could see the man's confidence wavering as he contemplated the possibility of exposure even after eliminating his immediate problems. 3 days, Wickham said finally. "I need 3 days to consider your proposal." "You have 1 day," Jake countered. "After that, we start talking to newspapers." Jake could see that Wickham wanted to refuse, but the man was trapped by his own guilty conscience and the evidence against him. Finally, the wealthy rancher nodded reluctantly. 1 day. But if you breathe a word of this to anyone before then, the deal is off." "Agreed," Jake said, though he had no intention of honoring any deal with a murderer. As Jake and Maria prepared to leave, Wickham made one final attempt to regain control of the situation. You know, Morrison, I could make you a very wealthy man. There's enough silver in Devil's Canyon to make us both rich beyond imagining. Why throw that away for the sake of some dead Apache? Jake looked at the man with disgust. Because some things are more important than money. You wouldn't understand. As they walked out of the study, past the confused and heavily armed ranch hands, Jake felt Maria's hand briefly touch his arm. "Thank you," she whispered. "For everything." "Don't thank me yet," Jake replied quietly. "This isn't over. Not by a long shot." He was right to be cautious. As they rode away from the Lazy W ranch, Jake could feel hostile eyes watching their every move. Samuel Wickham was not a man who accepted defeat gracefully, and Jake suspected that the next 24 hours were going to test everyone's courage to the limit. The sun was setting behind the distant mountains as they reached the outskirts of Copper Falls. Jake knew that somewhere in this vast landscape, 7 Apache women were hiding and waiting for justice for their murdered brother. He also knew that powerful men like Wickham didn't simply give up when their crimes were exposed. The real confrontation was yet to come. The old mission church sat like a crumbling ghost on the hill overlooking Copper Falls, its adobe walls bleached white by decades of desert sun and wind. Jake Morrison approached on foot, leading his horse Belle through the scattered mesquite bushes that surrounded the abandoned building. The morning air was crisp with the promise of another scorching Arizona day, but Jake's attention was focused on the subtle signs that told him he was being watched. Maria Delgado emerged from the shadows of the church doorway, followed by her 6 sisters. In daylight, Jake could see the family resemblance clearly. The same intelligent dark eyes, the same dignified bearing that refused to be broken by hardship or persecution. The youngest, who couldn't have been more than 16, stayed close to her oldest sister, while the others formed a protective circle around Maria. "Did Wickham agree to your terms?" Maria asked without preamble. Jake shook his head grimly. "He agreed to consider them, but I don't trust him to keep his word. Men like Wickham don't confess to murder unless they're forced to." "Then we force him," said another of the sisters, a woman with fierce eyes and calloused hands that spoke of hard work. "My name is Elena. Joseph was my twin brother. I know where he hid the evidence of the silver theft." Maria looked surprised. "Elena, you said you didn't know where Joseph kept his papers." "I lied," Elena replied bluntly. "I wanted to see if this cowboy could be trusted before risking everything. Joseph told me before he died that if anything happened to him, I should give his evidence to an honest lawman. The problem is, there aren't any honest lawmen in this territory except maybe the territorial marshal in Phoenix." Jake considered this new development. Phoenix was a 3-day ride from Copper Falls, and getting there alive with 7 Apache women would be nearly impossible with Wickham's men hunting them. "What kind of evidence are we talking about?" Jake asked. Elena reached into a leather pouch at her waist and pulled out a thick packet wrapped in oiled cloth. "Joseph documented everything for 6 months. Names, dates, amounts of silver stolen. He even drew maps showing where Wickham's men were digging unauthorized tunnels into the richest veins." Jake examined the papers carefully. Joseph Running Bear had been thorough in his investigation, recording not just what was stolen, but who was involved in the theft. The names included several prominent businessmen from Copper Falls, the corrupt Deputy Carson, and a territorial judge named Hartwell, who had been taking bribes to look the other way. "This is bigger than just Wickham," Jake realized. "This is a whole network of corruption." "Joseph discovered that the silver mine was being systematically looted," Elena explained. "Wickham and his partners were taking the best ore for themselves while reporting much lower yields to the territorial authorities. They were avoiding taxes and cheating the legitimate investors." Jake whistled low. This wasn't just theft. It was a conspiracy that reached into the territorial government itself. No wonder Joseph Running Bear had been murdered for asking questions. "There's something else," Maria said quietly. "Something Joseph discovered just before he died. He found out where Wickham was selling the stolen silver." She produced another document from Elena's packet, a shipping manifest with forged signatures and false destinations. "Wickham has been shipping silver bars to Mexico, where they're melted down and sold as Mexican silver," Maria continued. "He's been doing this for over 2 years, stealing thousands of dollars worth of ore." Jake studied the manifest with growing amazement. The scope of the crime was staggering. Wickham wasn't just a murderer. He was the head of a major criminal enterprise that had tentacles reaching into multiple territories. "Why didn't Joseph take this to the authorities immediately?" Jake asked. Elena's face darkened. "Because he tried. He went to Sheriff Morrison first, but Morrison is on Wickham's payroll. Then he tried to contact the territorial marshal directly, but Judge Hartwell intercepted his letter. That's when Joseph knew he was in real danger. So he hid the evidence and tried to get his family to safety," Jake concluded. "But we wouldn't leave without him," the youngest sister said, speaking for the first time. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but there was steel in it. "Joseph was protecting all of us. We couldn't abandon him." Jake felt a pang of sympathy for these women who had lost their brother while trying to seek justice through legal channels. They had done everything right, but the system was too corrupt to help them. "What's our next move?" Maria asked. "Wickham knows we have evidence against him. He's not going to wait much longer before trying to silence us permanently." As if summoned by her words, the sound of approaching horses echoed across the desert landscape. Jake quickly moved to the broken window of the old church and peered out through the cracked glass. "Riders coming from the south," he reported. "At least 8 men moving fast." Elena joined him at the window. "Wickham's ranch hands. He must have decided that negotiations are over." Jake's mind raced through their options. The old mission church offered some defensive advantages, but it wouldn't hold up against a sustained assault by armed men. They needed a way to escape, but 7 women and 1 man on horseback would be easy targets in the open desert. "Is there another way out of here?" Jake asked. "There's an old smuggler's tunnel that runs from the church basement to a cave system in the hills," Maria said. "Joseph showed it to us when we were children, but it's very narrow and dangerous." Jake weighed their choices quickly. Stay and fight 8 armed men with the women caught in the crossfire, or risk the tunnel system and hope it led to safety. "Show me the tunnel," he decided. Maria led them to a trap door hidden beneath a fallen beam in the corner of the church. The opening revealed a narrow shaft that disappeared into darkness below. "The tunnel runs for about half a mile," Maria explained as the sound of approaching horses grew louder. "It comes out in Devil's Canyon near the silver mine." Jake realized this might actually work to their advantage. If they could reach the mine, they might be able to find additional evidence of Wickham's crimes while avoiding his men. "Elena, you lead the way with the evidence," Jake instructed. "Maria, you bring up the rear with your sisters. I'll cover our escape and follow last." Just as Elena dropped through the trap door, the church door exploded inward. Tom Briggs stood in the opening, his scarred face twisted with rage and his gun drawn. Behind him, Jake could see several other armed men taking positions outside. "End of the line, Morrison," Briggs snarled. Wickham's patience has run out." Jake drew his Colt with lightning speed, putting a bullet through the doorframe inches from Briggs's head. "Your boss should have accepted my offer." Briggs dove for cover as Jake's shot sent splinters flying. The other Apache women were quickly disappearing through the trap door, but Maria hesitated. "Go!" Jake shouted, firing again to keep Briggs pinned down. "I'll be right behind you." Maria dropped through the opening just as more of Wickham's men appeared at the broken windows. Jake found himself in a running gun battle, moving from cover to cover while bullets splintered the old wooden pews around him. He made it to the trap door just as Briggs and 2 other men rushed into the church. Jake's last shot took one of them in the shoulder, sending the man spinning to the ground, before he dropped through the opening and pulled the trapdoor closed above him. The tunnel was even narrower than Maria had described, barely wide enough for a man to crawl through on his hands and knees. Jake could hear the Apache women ahead of him, moving as quickly as possible through the cramped space. Behind him, he could hear Briggs and his men discovering the trapdoor and arguing about whether to follow. The decision was made for them when Jake heard the distinctive sound of dynamite being prepared. Wickham's men were planning to blast the tunnel closed, trapping them underground. "Move faster!" Jake called ahead to Maria. "They're going to bring down the tunnel!" The next few minutes were a nightmare of crawling through absolute darkness, while loose rocks and dirt showered down from above. Jake's knees were scraped raw, and his shoulders ached from the cramped position, but he kept moving forward, driven by the knowledge that stopping meant death for all of them. The explosion, when it came, was devastating. The tunnel shook like an earthquake, and a section about 50 feet behind Jake collapsed entirely. Dust filled the air, making breathing almost impossible, but the women ahead continued moving toward what they hoped was safety. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, Jake saw light ahead. Elena's voice called back through the tunnel. "I can see the cave opening. We're almost out." They emerged into a natural cave system that opened onto a rocky ledge overlooking Devil's Canyon. Far below, Jake could see the silver mine workings, with their maze of tunnels, equipment sheds, and ore processing facilities. More importantly, he could see evidence of the illegal mining operation Joseph Running Bear had documented. Freshly dug tunnels extended far beyond the legitimate mining claims, reaching into areas that should have been protected Apache land. Piles of silver ore sat beside the processing equipment, much more than any legal mining operation should have produced. And most damning of all, Jake could see a wagon loaded with silver bars being prepared for shipment. "Joseph was right," Elena said grimly, looking down at the evidence of Wickham's crimes. "They've been stealing from our ancestral lands as well as from the legitimate mine investors." Jake studied the layout below, forming a plan. "If we can get down there and gather physical evidence, some of those silver bars, maybe some of the shipping documents, we'll have everything we need to expose Wickham's entire operation." "How do we get down there without being seen?" Maria asked. Jake pointed to a narrow trail that wound down the canyon wall. "That path leads to the back of the mine complex. Most of the workers will be in the main tunnels. If we're careful, we can get in and out without being detected." It was a risky plan, but their alternatives were limited. Wickham's men would eventually find another way around the collapsed tunnel, and staying in the cave system would only delay the inevitable confrontation. The descent into Devil's Canyon took nearly an hour, with Jake leading the way and constantly watching for guards or workers who might spot them. The Apache women moved with the silent grace of their ancestors, leaving no trace of their passage on the rocky trail. As they approached the mine complex, Jake could hear voices and the sound of equipment. Peering around a large boulder, he saw 2 guards stationed near the main entrance, while several workers loaded silver bars onto a heavy wagon. "Wait here," Jake whispered to Maria. "I'm going to get closer and see what we're dealing with." He crept through the shadows between the equipment sheds, using his years of wilderness experience to move without detection. What he discovered confirmed Joseph Running Bear's documentation, and then some. The illegal mining operation was massive, with tunnels extending in every direction from the legitimate workings. Silver ore was being processed around the clock, with the stolen output carefully separated from the legal mining yields. Jake even found shipping documents that showed regular deliveries to Mexican buyers who were clearly part of the money laundering operation. But as he prepared to retreat with this information, Jake heard a familiar voice that made his blood run cold. "Search every inch of this canyon," Samuel Wickham was saying to a group of armed men. Morrison and those Apache women are here somewhere, and I want them found. Jake realized that Wickham had anticipated their escape route and positioned men throughout the area. The wealthy rancher wasn't taking any chances. He planned to eliminate all witnesses to his crimes permanently. Moving carefully back to where the women were hidden, Jake found them clustered around Elena, who was studying her brother's documentation by the fading daylight. "Wickham's here with at least a dozen men," Jake reported quietly. "They're searching the entire canyon. We need to find a way out of here, fast." "There is no way out," Elena said grimly. "The only trail leads back the way we came, and Wickham's men will be watching it." Jake felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. 7 innocent women were depending on him to get them out of this situation alive, but their options were rapidly disappearing. Then Maria spoke up with an idea that was either brilliant or suicidal. "What if we don't try to escape?" she said. "What if we force a confrontation right here, where there's evidence of Wickham's crimes everywhere?" Jake stared at her. "You want to fight a dozen armed men in the open?" "I want to force Wickham to show his true nature in front of witnesses," Maria explained. "There are mine workers down there, and probably some who aren't part of his criminal operation. If we can expose his crimes publicly, some of those men might stand with us." It was a desperate plan, but Jake realized it might be their only chance. If they could create enough confusion and present enough evidence, they might be able to turn some of Wickham's own people against him. "We'll need to be very careful about how we do this," Jake said. "Once we show ourselves, there's no going back." Elena stood up, clutching her brother's evidence packet. "Joseph died trying to expose these crimes. I won't dishonor his memory by hiding in the rocks while his murderer walks free." The other sisters nodded in agreement, their faces showing the same determined courage that had sustained them through attempted hanging and pursuit across the desert. Jake checked his weapons one more time, the Colt .45 at his hip and the Winchester rifle he had carried through the tunnel. He had maybe 30 rounds total, enough for a short fight, but not a prolonged battle. "All right," he decided. "Here's what we're going to do." The plan they developed was simple but risky. Jake would approach the mine complex openly, calling for Wickham to come out and face him. While attention was focused on the confrontation, Maria and her sisters would position themselves where they could be seen by the workers, displaying Joseph's evidence and shouting the truth about Wickham's crimes. The key was timing and hoping that at least some of the mine workers had enough conscience left to recognize injustice when they saw it. As the sun began to set behind the canyon walls, painting the rocks red with fading light, Jake Morrison walked out into the open space in front of the mine complex. "Wickham!" he called out in a voice that echoed off the canyon walls. "I know you're here! Time to face the consequences of your crimes!" The response was immediate. Armed men appeared from behind buildings and equipment, their weapons trained on Jake. But it was Samuel Wickham himself who stepped out of the main office building, his expensive suit looking out of place in the dusty mining complex. "You should have taken my offer when you had the chance." "Morrison," Wickham called back, "now you're going to die in this godforsaken canyon, along with your Apache friends." "Maybe," Jake replied, his hand resting on his gun handle. "But first, everyone here is going to learn the truth about what you've been doing." That was the signal. Maria and her sisters stepped out from their hiding places, holding Joseph Running Bear's documentation high where all the mine workers could see it. "This man murdered my brother for exposing his crimes," Maria shouted. "Joseph Running Bear documented years of silver theft, and Samuel Wickham killed him to keep it secret." The effect was immediate and dramatic. Some of the mine workers looked confused, while others showed recognition and growing anger. Jake realized that several of them had probably suspected something was wrong with the mining operation, but had been afraid to speak up. "Don't listen to them," Wickham shouted to his men. "They're lying savages trying to steal what belongs to honest white folks." But Elena was already reading from Joseph's documentation, in a clear, carrying voice. June 15, 1882. Observed Tom Briggs and 3 other men removing 12 bars of processed silver from the secure storage area after dark. Silver loaded onto unmarked wagon and driven south toward Mexican border. One of the mine workers, a grizzled man with silver-stained hands, stepped forward. "I remember that night. I wondered why silver was being moved without paperwork." July 3, 1882, Elena continued. Discovered unauthorized tunnel extending onto Apache reservation land. Estimated $2,000 worth of ore extracted illegally. More workers were beginning to look uncomfortable, and Jake could see doubt creeping into the faces of some of Wickham's armed men. Wickham realized he was losing control of the situation. "Enough!" he shouted, drawing his ornate pistol. "Kill them all! I'll deal with any questions later." But his order wasn't immediately obeyed. Several of his men hesitated, unwilling to gun down unarmed women in front of witnesses. That hesitation was all Jake needed. He drew his Colt with lightning speed and put his first shot through Wickham's gun hand, sending the ornate pistol spinning into the dust. "The next shot goes through your heart," Jake warned, keeping his weapon trained on the wealthy rancher. The standoff that followed was tense but brief. The mine workers, confronted with evidence of massive theft and their boss's willingness to commit murder to cover it up, began to side with Jake and the Apache women. Several of Wickham's own gunmen, realizing they were on the wrong side of a losing fight, quietly laid down their weapons. Tom Briggs, however, was not ready to surrender. The scarred foreman raised his rifle toward Maria, but Jake's shot took him in the chest before he could fire. Briggs fell backward into the dust, his expression of surprise frozen on his face as he died. The sight of their leader falling broke the last resistance among Wickham's men. Within minutes, the survivors had surrendered their weapons, and Samuel Wickham found himself under citizen's arrest by his own mine workers. "You fools don't know what you're doing," Wickham snarled as workers tied his hands with mining rope. "I own this territory. I'll be free before sunset tomorrow." "Maybe," Jake said, examining the evidence Elena had preserved. "But first you're going to answer for Joseph Running Bear's murder, and for everything else you've done." As night fell over Devil's Canyon, Jake helped the Apache women gather additional evidence from the mine complex. They found shipping records, false accounting books, and physical proof of the illegal mining operations that corroborated everything Joseph had documented. The territorial marshal, when he finally arrived 3 days later, found one of the most complete criminal cases he had ever seen. Samuel Wickham, his corrupt deputy, and Judge Hartwell were all arrested on charges ranging from theft and fraud to murder and conspiracy. The trial, held in Phoenix 6 months later, became legendary throughout Arizona Territory. Maria Delgado and her sisters testified with dignity and courage, while Jake Morrison's testimony about the attempted hanging and subsequent cover-up shocked even hardened frontier courtrooms. Samuel Wickham was sentenced to hang for the murder of Joseph Running Bear. His vast criminal enterprise was dismantled, and the stolen silver was returned to its rightful owners. The mine was placed under honest management, and the Apache workers were given fair wages for their labor. As for Jake Morrison, he found that his solitary days on the trail were over. The Apache people had adopted him as an honorary brother for his role in exposing their oppressors, while the territorial government offered him a position as a federal marshal. But perhaps the most significant change came when Maria Delgado asked him to stay in Arizona and help establish a school for Apache children. Jake discovered that justice wasn't just about stopping bad men, it was also about building something better in their place. Standing on the front porch of the new schoolhouse as the Arizona sun set behind the mountains, Jake reflected on the strange turns his life had taken. He had started out tracking stolen cattle and ended up exposing one of the largest criminal conspiracies in territorial history. The 7 Apache sisters had not only survived their ordeal, but had used it as a foundation for creating positive change in their community. Joseph Running Bear's sacrifice had not been in vain. His evidence had brought down a network of corruption that had poisoned an entire region. And Jake Morrison, the solitary cowboy who preferred the company of his horse to most people, had found himself part of a family and a community that valued justice over profit and courage over comfort. As evening stars began to appear in the desert sky, Jake knew that his wandering days were finally over. He had found something worth staying for, and something worth protecting. The frontier was changing, but with people like the Running Bear sisters fighting for what was right, maybe it was changing for the better. The sound of children's laughter drifted from the schoolhouse behind him, and Jake smiled. Some endings, he reflected, were really just new beginnings in disguise.